Well, Lucy's excited about today's episode. So am I, though. This is going to be a good one. Well, hello there, and welcome to episode 12 of B.Hooked TV. Thank you so much for joining me today. So I'm going to present you with 7 things I wish I knew much sooner when it comes to amigurumi and crocheting amigurumi projects, but these are in no particular order. I'm numbering them just to make it a little bit easier for myself, but one is not greater than the other. These are all very helpful tips that I wish I knew much sooner because my amigurumi projects would have been a lot better if I knew all of these at once. And that's my goal, to help you get better at your amigurumi projects with these 7.5, we'll say, little tips. All right, before we get to it though, I want to say a big thank you to Lion Brand for sponsoring this episode and the entire season of B.Hooked TV. And I'm delighted to share this particular yarn with you today, and that is Re-Up. Now, Re-Up is a cotton yarn, and I have picked this one specifically for this episode because cotton yarn is great for amigurumi projects. Hint, hint, that might be a little spoiler there, but Re-Up is a great value cotton that doesn't feel like a value cotton. Now, Re-Up is in the worsted weight category, so it's your medium number 4 yarn. It's made up of 85% cotton and 15% polyester. One of these is recycled and it saves 5,900 cups of water. That's just crazy. You can save the planet stitch by stitch. That's one of the little taglines that Lion Brand has for this yarn, and I think it's wonderful. I think it's a great cause, but it's also a great yarn to use. Re-Up is a newer to me cotton. It's not something that I have completed a lot of really big projects in yet, but it's something that I am really enjoying. So if you're looking for a good, economical, affordable cotton yarn for an upcoming project, I'll have a link in the video description below. Just click on that and it'll direct you to Lion Brand's website where you can see the different colorways that are available. And if you decide that it's right for your next project and you decide to purchase some through that link, thank you so much for doing so. I really appreciate that because Lion Brand is a sponsor of this entire season of B.Hooked TV. All right, so the first thing I wish I knew much sooner for my amigurumi projects is to use a smaller crochet hook, but loosen my tension. I know it sounds counterintuitive, right? But let's look at Re-Up for example. This yarn recommends a 5.5 millimeter crochet hook. So to crochet an amigurumi project with this, I would start at a 4.5 millimeter. So I'm dropping down 2 full sizes or 1 millimeter for that project, but I'm making sure that as I'm crocheting it, I'm doing so a little more loose. Now that aspect of it is a little more advanced as you get better and more skilled with crochet and just get more comfortable with holding the yarn in the hook. You'll be able to control the tension, specifically the tension that's coming from your yarn hand and going to the project. If you have that super tight, then your stitches are going to be tighter, more condensed. And that's great, and it usually doesn't cause a lot of problems, but particularly for amigurumi, something that's going to be stretched and something that's going to be stuffed, that tighter tension can cause more visible holes in your project. And let's say, for example, you're working on a black bear and you have white polyfill stuffing. You can't get much more contrasty than that. So if you have any holes whatsoever in those stitches, then you're going to see that stuffing through it. So what I have found is that by dropping down my hook size and by loosening my tension just a little bit, I can minimize those holes even more. Okay, the next thing, the second thing I wish I knew much sooner for my amigurumi projects was to use the invisible decrease. I'll be honest, I wasn't a believer at first. It didn't seem like it was going to be useful at all. It's not worked entirely different. Really, the only difference between the invisible decrease and just a standard single crochet 2 together decrease is where you're working your hook. So think about just a standard stitch, and probably for a lot of your amigurumi projects, you may be familiar with working in both loops of that V, basically the top part of the stitch. So you would do that in a standard decrease as well. But in the invisible version, rather than catch both of those loops of the V, you're just catching the front loop. And to me, I thought, why does that even work? It doesn't seem like I'm doing anything different, and I completely dismissed the idea of it. But hear me out. I want you to be a firm believer in this as well. So when you're working the invisible decrease, it does not look at all different on the front side because you're still working that stitch in the front part, so it looks the same on the outside. But what's happening on the inside is that remaining loop from that V is sort of covering up that little gap, that little hole that always occurs when you do a single crochet two together. That decrease causes a hole, but those exposed little loops at the back side of the work helps to conceal those holes. All right, now the third thing I wish I knew sooner for my amigurumi projects really seems very basic, but honestly, I didn't know this at the very beginning, that it's best to work in a spiral when you're crocheting these projects so that you can eliminate any possibility of a join on the other side. If you've ever joined while single crocheting, you will probably realize very quickly that that join likes to travel, and it's visible, and that's just not something that you want in your amigurumi projects. So rather than join at the end of every single one of your amigurumi rounds, continuing just single crocheting in that next stitch, you can work in a spiral and eliminate any possible visible join or anything like that. Now that actually brings me into the fourth thing I wish I knew with the amigurumi projects, and that is to always, always use stitch markers. If there's anything I have learned, it's that I should not trust my memory. I always think, okay, I can look at these increases. I can figure out when I need to increase. I don't really need to know what round I'm on. I'm almost always wrong in those situations when I try to depend on that. Or I might just take a mental note and say, yeah, this is the beginning of my round. Just trust me. Don't do that. Use a stitch marker. I personally like to use these locking stitch markers because they stay in place and I don't have to worry about them falling out. But there are tons of different varieties that you can use. There are some that sort of spin into place. I've even been known to use a bobby pin if I didn't have a stitch marker right there handy, but I had a bobby pin in my hair. That totally works. You can even use just a scrap little piece of yarn. Whatever your stitch marker looks like, just use one to help you know what the first stitch of that round is so that your increases are right and so that your pieces look as they should. Trust me, you'll realize how much easier a stitch marker can make your life and your amigurumi projects. Now we're sort of on the stitch marker theme here because the fifth thing I wish I knew about amigurumi projects is to use locking stitch markers specifically to help with the seaming process. Seaming is always my least favorite thing because it really can be the thing that destroys your project, right? It's so difficult to get those limbs and pieces sewn in the right place. They almost always shift on you. But what I found is if I use a locking stitch marker, it's a little safer than a safety pin. I tend to always poke myself with the safety pin, but that really would work exactly the same. But for these locking stitch markers, again, you don't have to worry about poking yourself, and they will help keep your piece positioned. Now, because they're a little bit bigger, and depending on how big your piece is, it will allow for a little bit of shifting. So keep that in mind. It's not a perfect fix, but it really does make seaming things together so much easier. All right, now the sixth thing I wish I knew much sooner for my amigurumi projects was to use cotton yarn. And trust me, I'm not just saying this because Re-Up is the sponsored yarn and the yarn used here in demo. I really love to use cotton for amigurumi because cotton doesn't stretch as much. It doesn't have as much give to it. And because of that, you can stuff it a little bit better, a little bit more firm. So I tend to prefer cotton yarn whenever possible. Now, I do like to do amigurumi projects with random off the wall, like chunky yarn sometimes, which you see here in Lucy. That's a number 6 chunky yarn that she is worked in. But generally speaking, I like to go to cotton yarn first so that I'm not having any possibility of stretching and, of course, seeing that stuffing through the work. And the 7th thing I wish I knew much sooner for my amigurumi projects is to not stuff it so firm. This is something that I did all the time. I thought the firmer I could stuff it, the better the shape would be. And that is so far from the truth. Really, what I like to do, my general rule of thumb for stuffing, is just get enough stuffing in there to keep it from caving in on itself. Because you don't want to stretch out those fibers and risk being able to see that stuffing through your stitches. Now, along those lines, I mentioned I had a little bonus tip for you, and that is for limbs specifically. Now, if you're working on smaller amigurumi projects with limbs, most of the time, I won't even stuff those. I've worked on a doll in the past, and that one had just really skinny arms. I didn't stuff those at all. I didn't actually need to. So when it comes to stuffing your amigurumi projects, again, just remember to keep it minimal. Don't, stuff it too much. And in the areas where you want it to sort of contour, don't add any stuffing there because the stuffing is going to make it rigid and really stick out. All right, so those are the 7.5 things that I wish I knew much sooner for my amigurumi projects. And now I would love to know your tips as well. I don't know it all, and I'm still learning every single day. But more importantly, I know that there are a lot of people who are in this community that are trying to improve their skills and get better, and they love amigurumi, but maybe they're just sort of hung up on the idea that they don't turn out the way they want them to. So please leave me your amigurumi tips, your number 1 tip, in the comment section below so I can read that, so other members of the community can read that as well. All right, one last thing before I go, please don't forget to check out the video description below for a link to Re-Up Online Brand's website so you can see if it's right for your next project. I mean, seriously, give this stuff a try. It's a great cotton yarn and it's super affordable. And honestly, it's my go-to cotton now. I don't really see a reason to use any other type of cotton. So again, that link is in the video description below. Also, if you're not subscribed already, I would love for you to please consider doing so. I know that doesn't sound like a whole lot. It doesn't seem like subscribing really helps, but it does. Not only does it motivate me, but it also will give me the opportunity to continue sharing episodes like this. Okay, that'll wrap up this week's episode of B.Hooked TV. Thank you so much for your time today. I really do appreciate it, and I look forward to seeing you next week in another episode.